London, September 10, 1797. In a small house in Somers Town, William Godwin sits beside a dying woman with a diary open on his knee. He has been here for 11 days. The woman in the bed is his wife. She is 38 years old. Her breathing is shallow now. The physicians have come and gone. Hope has quietly left the room. But Godwin remains, writing down the hour, the symptoms, the silences, the last evidence that she is still here. Her name is Mary Wollstonecraft. 5 years earlier, she published A Vindication of the Rights of Woman and argued, in language the world was not ready for, that women were not ornaments or property. They were human beings, and human beings deserved education, dignity, reason, and freedom. The book made her known. It also made her dangerous. Now she is dying from childbirth fever in a city that does not yet understand what it is losing. Godwin will write down the exact minute she stops breathing, because he believes she deserves to be witnessed truthfully. He is right, but the truth he later publishes will cost her more than either of them can yet see. This is the story of Mary Wollstonecraft, the girl who taught herself what the world refused to teach her. The writer who argued that women's weakness was not natural but manufactured, and the mind that history tried to bury but could not keep buried. A note before we begin. Scenes and interior moments are reconstructed from Mary's letters, Godwin's diary and memoir, and the scholarship of Janet Todd and Lyndall Gordon. Where the record is clear, this account follows it. Where evidence is uncertain, this account says, so, settle in. Tonight we follow the complete life of a woman who wrote one of the earliest blueprints for modern women's rights, before the world had a name for what she was doing. We begin at the beginning, and the beginning is not promising. Chapter 1. The Wrong Kind of Family. Spitalfields, London, 1759. The street outside is already loud at this hour. It is April, which in London means a cold that has not yet fully decided to leave, and the sounds of a weaving district coming to life in the early morning move through the thin walls of the houses on Primrose Street with the regularity of a place organised entirely around work. Looms, voices, the particular rhythm of a neighbourhood that has been producing cloth since before anyone currently living can remember. Inside one of these houses, a woman has just given birth to her second child. The child is a girl. She will be baptized with several names in the Lutheran tradition. The name that will last is Mary. Her father is Edward John Wollstonecraft, the son of a successful weaver who built a small textile business in this district and left behind enough money to give his children a genuine start in life. Edward John received his share of that inheritance and proceeded, across the following decades, to demonstrate with remarkable consistency that money in the hands of a man without discipline is simply a slower form of poverty. He wanted to be a gentleman farmer. This was a common ambition among men of his class and generation. The idea that land was the true foundation of English respectability. That trade was something you escaped from rather than built on. He had enough of his father's money to attempt the fantasy. He did not have enough of his father's character to sustain it. The family moved, repeatedly, and in the pattern of people whose circumstances are controlled by someone else's decisions, from Spitalfields to Epping to Barking to a farm in Yorkshire to a farm in Wales. Each move representing a new attempt to make the land produce what his management could not. The money shrank with each attempt. The household shrank with it. Mary's mother was Elizabeth Dixon Wollstonecraft, a woman about whom history has preserved relatively little, which is itself a document of the age she lived in. She was 22 when Mary was born. She had grown up with connections to minor families of northern Europe and had understood since girlhood that she was meant for something larger than what she had received. Her marriage to Edward John was respectable. She felt the distance between respectable and what she had imagined. Every day of her life she favoured Ned, the eldest son. This was not unusual. The eldest son in a middling English family was the practical investment, the one toward whom the household's limited emotional energy was most efficiently directed. Mary, the second child and eldest daughter, understood her position in this calculation early, and with a clarity that did not leave her. She decided, in the wordless way that children make decisions before they have language for them, that this was a fact about her family rather than a fact about her. There was something else in the house, something that shaped the atmosphere of every room. Every evening, every morning after, Edward John drank, not in the social way that men of his era routinely drank, though he did that too. He drank in the way that changes the quality of the air in a house. That makes children learn to read footsteps on the stairs before a door opens. That makes the sound of a chair scraping across a floor carry more information than it should. Mary's younger siblings absorbed this. But Mary, as the eldest daughter, absorbed the most. There are passages in her letters from later years, written to friends when the distance of time had made honesty easier, describing nights spent outside her mother's bedroom door. She was a child, placing herself between her mother and whatever the night might bring. This is not a small detail. It is the kind of formation that does not leave a person. It teaches you that the people who are supposed to protect you sometimes need protecting themselves. It teaches you that waiting for someone else to manage a dangerous situation is a strategy with a poor track record. It teaches you, at a level below conscious thought, that your survival depends on your own clear reading of what is happening rather than on the official version. The adults around you prefer to maintain. She was learning these lessons before she had words for them. They would show up in everything she wrote. The formal education available to her was the standard education for girls of her class, which is to say, almost nothing worth the name. Dame schools. Small operations run by women in their homes, where girls learn to read adequately, to sew, and to conduct themselves in ways appropriate to their station. The purpose was not to produce thinking persons. It was to produce marriageable ones. Mary attended what was available, and was bored by it in the complete way of a mind being offered considerably less than it requires. She read whatever she could find in whatever house the family currently occupied. She worked through her father's books, which reflected his aspirations more than his intellect. She read through them and kept looking. In the neighbourhood of Newington Butts, where the family lived for a period during Mary's early teens, she found something more useful than her father's library. A clergyman named Mr. Clare and his wife ran an informal circle for the young people of the neighbourhood. They lent books, they discussed ideas, they treated the minds of the young people around them as things worth developing rather than containing. For Mary, this was the first experience of being taken seriously by adults who had nothing to gain from keeping her small. She was also, in this neighbourhood, about to meet the person who would become the most important relationship of her early life. Frances Blood, known as Fanny, was a year or two older than Mary, the daughter of a family in financial difficulties not unlike Mary's own. She was gentle where Mary was intense, patient where Mary was urgent, possessed of a genuine artistic talent that she exercised with a quiet seriousness that Mary found, on first encounter, almost incomprehensible. She had not known many people who were simply kind without calculation. Fanny Blood was kind without calculation. The friendship that began in those years in Newington Butts would shape the next decade of Mary's life. It would also, eventually, become the first great loss she did not know how to survive. But that was still ahead, for now she was a teenager in a cold house, and the question that was forming in her had not yet found its shape. The question was whether the arrangement, the way her family was organized, with her father's failures protected by custom, while her mother and children absorbed the consequences without recourse, was natural, whether someone had designed it, whether it could be argued with. She did not know yet that answering that question would be the work of her life. The question was already there. It would not go away. Chapter 2. The education she was denied and took anyway. Newington Green, North London, 1783. It is a Tuesday evening in early autumn, and the candles in the meeting-house on the green have been lit early because the days are shortening. Richard Price, who is 60 years old and has spent most of his adult life preaching and writing about liberty and rational government, is speaking to a gathering of his congregation and their friends. The people in the room include weavers and small merchants and school teachers and a handful of young men who have come from London specifically to hear him. In the back of the room, listening with the full attention she brought to everything that deserved it, is a young woman of 24 who has recently moved to this neighbourhood to open a small school for girls with her friend Fanny Blood and their mutual friend Sarah Berg. Her name is Mary Wollstonecraft, and she has been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, for a room exactly like this one. To understand why this room mattered, you have to understand what female education in 1783 actually was, the word that appeared most often in the educational literature of the period, in the conduct books and the school prospectuses and the advice manuals written for parents of daughters, was ornamental. Women were to be ornamental. Their education was to make them more pleasing additions to the households they would eventually join as wives. Adequate reading, some music, some drawing, enough French to manage a conversation at a dinner party. The purpose was not to produce a person. It was to produce a wife. Mary had been fighting this since she was old enough to understand it was what was being done to her. She had taught herself in the fragments of time available between the demands of a household that moved constantly and needed managing. She had read whatever she could find. She had worked through her father's books, borrowed from Mr. Clare's household, read by whatever light was available. But reading alone, without the conversation that tests ideas and shows you where your thinking has gaps, is a limited education. What Mary had been missing, without a precise name for the missing thing, was exactly what Price's circle provided. Price was a dissenter, meaning he belonged to the Protestant tradition that sat outside the official Church of England. This position, outside the establishment, had given his community a particular quality of intellectual seriousness. Dissenters had been excluded from Oxford and Cambridge by the laws requiring conformity to the Church of England, and this exclusion had pushed them to build their own educational institutions, many of which offered a more rigorous and modern curriculum than the ancient universities. The culture around price reflected this. Arguments were expected to carry their own weight. The fact that something had always been done a certain way was not considered an adequate defence of continuing to do it. Here is a detail about Price that most accounts of this period pass over. He owned one of the better private libraries in Newington Green, and he lent from it without the caution that private libraries usually inspired in their owners. He had been lending books to the young people of the neighbourhood for years before Mary arrived, and his approach to this lending was itself a kind of philosophy. He gave people books that were ahead of where they currently were, books that would require effort and return something proportional to the effort. He believed that the mind grew in response to being stretched, rather than being met exactly where it was. The first book he lent Mary was, by her own account, in a letter to a friend, written some years later and paraphrased by her biographer, Janet Todd, one she had to read twice before she understood why she needed it. She read it twice. She understood why she needed it. She came back for the next one. For Mary, arriving in this circle in her mid-20s, the effect was immediate and cumulative. She had been thinking carefully for years, without anyone treating her thinking as worth engaging with seriously. Here, her observations were met with counter-arguments rather than polite dismissal. Here, the quality of her mind was visible in a way it had not been in the households and positions she had occupied before. She read widely in these years. Locke on the social contract and the basis of legitimate authority, Rousseau on education and natural human development, though she would eventually turn on Rousseau with considerable force when she understood what his ideas about women actually implied. The histories of Rome and the Greek city-states she had been working through since childhood, the emerging literature of the Enlightenment, the argument that human reason, properly developed, was capable of understanding the world and improving it. She was connecting these arguments to the specific women she knew, her mother, who had spent her life absorbing the consequences of her husband's failures without recourse, Fanny Blood, whose considerable artistic talent was being consumed by the necessity of supporting her family rather than developing her own work, the girls in the small school on the Green, who responded to genuine intellectual engagement with an alertness that the standard curriculum never produced. The connection between the philosophical arguments about liberty and the practical conditions of women's lives was, to Mary's mind, not difficult to see. It was only invisible to people who had an interest in not seeing it. In these same years, she was developing a relationship with a publisher named Joseph Johnson, who operated from St. Paul's Churchyard in London. Johnson published radicals and dissenters, and people whose ideas sat at the edge of what the establishment was comfortable with. He had a gift for recognizing writing that contained something real. She showed him some of what she had been writing in the evenings after the school closed. He told her it was publishable. This was not a small moment. To be told by a serious publisher that what you had written deserved to exist in the world. When you were a 24-year-old woman who had educated yourself in borrowed time and borrowed books, when the institutions that produced recognized writers had not been available to you, it was not a small moment. The school in Newington Green would close within a year. The reasons were financial and personal and connected to Fanny Blood's deteriorating health and the situation developing in Lisbon that would end in the loss. This account turns to in the next chapter. But the years of the school and the Price Circle and the first conversations with Johnson had given Mary something durable, a framework for the argument she was building, a language for the question she had been carrying since childhood. She was 24 years old. She had found the channel for what she had been accumulating. What she had not yet found was the occasion to use it at full scale. That was still ahead. Outside the window of the small house where she was writing, Newington Green was settling into the quiet of a late autumn evening, the candles going out one by one in the meeting house across the way, the trees along the green holding the last of the year's leaves against a sky that was already turning toward winter. She kept writing. Chapter 3. Fanny Blood and the First Great Loss. Lisbon, November 1785. The harbour comes into view through a grey morning, the city rising on its hills above the Tagus River, the light flat and cold in a way that makes the warmer climate the doctors had promised feel like something that belongs to a different season. Mary Wollstonecraft stands at the rail of the ship and looks at the city she has crossed the Bay of Biscay in rough November weather to reach. She crossed the Bay of Biscay in November because Fanny was there and Fanny needed her. The message that had reached her in London several weeks earlier was not specific in its details, but was specific enough in its implications. Fanny Blood had married Hugh Skeys earlier that year and had gone with him to Lisbon for the warmer climate that was supposed to benefit the illness in her lungs, that the damp cold of English winters did not improve. Now she was pregnant. The pregnancy was not going well. There was no one there who knew her. Mary had left the school in the middle of term. She had arranged for her sisters to manage it in her absence. She had booked passage and crossed the bay in weather that most people would have considered a reason to wait for a calmer season. She did not wait. She arrived to find Fanny in labour. The baby was born. It did not survive. Fanny did not survive either. She died within days of the birth. In November of 1785, 26 years old. Mary was 26 years old, and the person she loved most in the world was gone. To understand what this loss meant requires understanding what Fanny had actually been. Not simply a close friend, though she was that. Not simply the person Mary had planned to build a life alongside, though she was that too. Fanny was the first person who had received Mary's full intensity without flinching from it. The first person who had known Mary's family, the cold house, the father's drinking, the mother's slow disappearance into exhaustion, and had continued to be present anyway, with warmth rather than pity, with genuine affection rather than the careful management of a difficult person. There is something else worth saying about Fanny Blood. She had been a person of genuine talent. She drew and painted with a skill that deserved development and serious attention. She had taught well. She had thought clearly. She had been, in the full sense of the phrase, a capable human being, and she had spent her adult life supporting her family's financial failures, waiting for a man to arrange his circumstances well enough to marry her, travelling to a foreign city in the hope that a different climate might slow what was already happening to her lungs, and dying in childbirth at 26 in a place where she knew almost no one, with no work of her own to leave behind. The waste was not incidental. It was systematic. It was what happened to capable women in a world not built to allow them to develop their capability into anything lasting. Mary had been watching this operate for 26 years. Now it had taken the person she loved most. She returned to England, changed. The school had accumulated debts in her absence and could not be sustained. She closed it. The community that had supported her for several years dissolved at the same moment. The person most central to her emotional life was gone. She was 26 years old, in debt, without the school, without Fanny. She did what she always did when the available options were all inadequate. She worked. She deepened her connection with Johnson. She reviewed books for his analytical review, translated from French and German, produced the regular literary labour that kept writers solvent. She was reading constantly and thinking constantly, and she was, in the specific way that writers process what they cannot otherwise contain, turning the experience of loss. The question Fanny's death raised was one she had been circling for years. How many Fanny Bloods were there? How many women of genuine capability were being consumed by a world not built to allow them to develop that capability into anything lasting? The answer, which Mary knew without needing to calculate it, was almost all of them. The governess position followed. This was the employment that Mary later described with a bitterness she did not moderate. And understanding why requires understanding what a governess actually was. A governess was a woman of education and relative refinement who had not secured a husband and therefore needed to support herself in a world where the options for doing so were severely limited. She lived in the house of a wealthy family. She taught the children. She was educated enough to be trusted with young minds, and not wealthy or well-born enough to be treated as a social equal. She occupied a position that had no honest name. Not a servant, exactly. Not a member of the household in any meaningful sense. Present and invisible simultaneously. Mary worked as a governess for the Kingsborough family in Ireland, from 1786 to 1787. She taught the Kingsborough daughters and watched the household and wrote in whatever hours were available, and found the experience clarifying in the specific way that deeply unpleasant experiences sometimes are. It showed her the full version of the thing she had been analysing. The governess position was not an aberration. It was the logical conclusion of a particular line of reasoning about women. If women's minds were ornamental rather than substantive, then a woman of education who needed to support herself had nothing to sell except the domestic function in its most servile form. She was living proof of the argument she was building. She returned to London in 1787. Johnson published her first book, Thoughts on the Education of Daughters. That year, it was a chair full and measured, written with an awareness of the audience it needed to reach. It was not yet the book she was building toward, but it was real. It was in the world. She was 28 years old. Fanny had been dead for 2 years. The grief had become something she carried rather than something that stopped her. She had learned, in the years since Lisbon, the difference between those two things. She kept going. The argument kept building. Chapter 4. Governess. Teacher. Writer building a voice. London. A winter evening. 1789. The fire in Johnson's dining room has been burning for several hours, and the table has been cleared, and the conversation has moved, as it usually moves in this room, from the business of publishing to the business of ideas, which in this particular year are indistinguishable from each other because the ideas are currently being tested in the streets of Paris, and everyone at this table has an opinion about what the testing means. Thomas Paine is at the table. He is 52 years old and has already helped make one revolution and is watching another one begin from this room in London with the specific alertness of a man who recognizes the shape of what he is looking at. William Blake is here tonight, the engraver and poet whose work Johnson publishes and whose ideas about imagination and spiritual freedom connect, in ways that are not always easy to articulate, to the political arguments being made around him. Henry Fuseli, the painter, is at the far end of the table, holding a position on something with the particular force of a man who holds all his positions with considerable force. And there is Mary Wollstonecraft, 30 years old, who has been part of this circle for 2 years and who is, on this particular evening, in the middle of an argument with Paine about the relationship between political rights and social institutions that has been going on, with interruptions for dinner. For approximately 90 minutes, she is not losing the argument. This detail matters more than it might appear to. Mary had spent her 20s in positions defined by the requirement to make herself useful without making herself visible. Lady's companion, schoolteacher, governess. To be present without being inconvenient, to have opinions without expressing them in ways that would make the men around her feel challenged. In Johnson's dining room, none of these requirements applied. The voice she was developing in these years had specific qualities that set it apart from the educated prose of the period. It was direct. The educated writing of the late 18th century tended toward elaboration and qualification. The long sentence that arrived at its point through careful accumulation, Mary moved toward her point without apology. Some readers found this invigorating. Others found it unseemly. The unseemliness, she understood, was at least partly a response to the fact that a woman was doing it. Directness in male writers was called clarity. In female writers, it was called something else. She kept doing it anyway. The voice was also grounded in specific experience, in a way that much educated writing of the period was not. She argued from what she had seen, the specific women she had known, the specific households she had occupied, the specific texture of what it felt like to be inside, the arrangements she was analysing. The philosophy was tethered to the particular, and the particular she knew best was the evidence of her own life. Johnson had published her first book in 1787. He published a children's book called Original Stories from Real Life in 1788, which Blake illustrated. Blake drew a woman leading 2 children by the hand, her posture upright and purposeful, moving forward through a landscape that is not entirely defined. It was a small commission. It was also, in retrospect, one of the more precise visual descriptions of what Mary was trying to do in everything she wrote. She was also reviewing books for Johnson's Analytical Review, producing the regular critical work that kept writers solvent and kept their minds engaged with the full range of what was being thought and published. She was building, through the discipline of writing responses that had to be both accurate and argued, a critical intelligence that was becoming recognizably her own. There is a letter she wrote to her sister Everina in this period, paraphrased by her biographer Janet Todd, in which she says she is beginning to understand that she has a mind capable of more than she has yet been allowed to do with it, and that she intends to find out what that more is. The sentence is characteristic in its combination of confidence and practicality. She was not simply dreaming of larger possibilities. She was stating an intention. In the autumn of 1790, the occasion she had been moving toward arrived. The Bastille had fallen in July of 1789. A king whose authority rested on divine right was suddenly subject to the will of the people he governed. The claims of the Enlightenment, the arguments about natural rights and rational government that Price and his circle had been discussing for years, were being tested in real time in the streets of Paris. Richard Price preached a sermon in November of 1789, celebrating the Revolution as a vindication of the principles of liberty. He was 70 years old, and moved by what he was watching with a depth that his congregation could hear in his voice. Edmund Burke read the sermon and was furious. Mary read Burke's response when it appeared. She sat with it for several days. She understood that it was serious, and that it was wrong in specific ways, and that she had the counter-argument already assembled. She sat down to write it. Within weeks she had a book. Chapter 5. The Revolution Next Door. London, November 1790. The manuscript is on Johnson's desk. Mary has been writing for several weeks with the focused intensity of someone who has been building the argument for years, and has finally found the exact object to argue against. Burke's reflections on the Revolution in France gave her that object, not because the argument was simple to refute, but because it was sophisticated enough to require a real answer, and she had the real answer already assembled from years of reading and observing and thinking. She had been assembling it since she was a teenager in a cold house reading books by firelight. Johnson reads the manuscript. He publishes it. A Vindication of the Rights of Men appeared in November of 1790. Initially, without her name attached, anonymous publication was common for politically charged work in this period. But within weeks, Johnson published a second edition with her name on the title page. She was among the first to publish a book-length response to Burke, appearing in print ahead of Thomas Paine's Rights of Man. She was not willing to let the response belong to no one. Burke's central claim, stripped to its essentials, was a defence of inherited social order against the claims of abstract reason. The institutions of English society, the monarchy, the aristocracy, the established church, the common law, were not to be judged against some philosophical ideal of rational organisation. They were to be valued precisely because they had survived across generations, and their survival was evidence of a wisdom encoded in practice that no system of reason could fully replace. It was a serious argument. It remains a serious argument. Mary found it serious, and found it wrong in ways that illuminated the larger argument she had been building about women. Her response made a single, clean move that the sophistication of Burke's prose could not deflect. If survival was the criterion of legitimacy, then everything that had survived alongside those institutions was legitimate too. Poverty had survived. The degradation of the poor had survived. The legal subordination of women had survived. Burke's argument, if followed honestly, could be used to defend anything that existed, which meant it could not distinguish between what deserved to exist and what did not. She was not arguing abstractly. She was arguing from the evidence of what she had seen. Burke had also written, with considerable rhetorical skill, about the chivalric tradition that placed women on a pedestal, protected and elevated. Mary's response to this was brief and pointed. The pedestal was a cage. The elevation was a way of keeping women out of the conversations where actual decisions were made. The chivalric reverence for women was not respect for women as persons. It was a carefully constructed alternative to respecting women as persons, an elaborate performance of regard that made the actual denial of their rights and their reason appear to be a form of honour. She said this in terms that made her meaning impossible to miss. The rights of men was received with the mixture of recognition and hostility that attaches to an argument that has finally said clearly what many people had been thinking. The radical press responded warmly. The dissenting community responded warmly. Price, who was aging and whose health was declining, read it and wrote to her with the warmth of a teacher who has watched a student exceed what the teaching could have produced. The hostile response was equally instructive about what the argument had hit, but the rights of men was, among other things, a testing of the ground, a first full articulation of the philosophical framework she intended to take further, in the next book, toward the question that had been forming in her since childhood. She had the argument, she had the language, she had the evidence accumulated from years of observation. She needed 9 weeks. The specific target was everywhere. It was in Rousseau's Emile, published in 1762, the most influential educational text of the Enlightenment, which argued that girls should be educated to please men, that their reason was not to be developed for its own sake, but in service of their domestic function. The ideal woman of Emile, Sophie, was a person of charm and compliance rather than character and capability. Rousseau wanted a natural man. He wanted an artificial woman. Mary had noticed the contradiction and was ready to name it. The target was in the conduct books that filled the shelves of English households. James Fordyce's Sermons to Young Women and John Gregory's A Father's Legacy to His Daughters were among the most widely read, advising women to suppress their opinions in the company of men, to affect ignorance of things they understood in order to make men comfortable, to prioritize appearance and agreeableness over any quality of mind that might make them interesting as persons rather than attractive as objects. The target was in the legal structure that made women, upon marriage, legally non-existent. A married woman could not own property. She could not make contracts. She could not sue or be sued in her own name. She was, in the precise legal language of the period, a femme covert, a woman covered by her husband's legal identity. The target was in every room she had ever occupied. She sat down in 1791. She wrote, London, late November, 1791. The city outside is moving through the specific darkness of early winter. The lamplighters, making their rounds through streets that are quieter at this hour than they will be in a few hours when the morning trade begins. In a house on Store Street, not far from Johnson's rooms, a candle is still burning. Mary has been at her desk since before the household woke up. She will be at her desk when it goes to sleep again. She has been doing this for weeks. The manuscript beside her is growing in the specific way of something that has been waiting a long time to exist. She is 32 years old, and she is writing the book she was born to write. Chapter 6. The Book That Changed Everything. London, January 1792. The book arrives at the booksellers and the lending libraries, and the private addresses of people who follow what Johnson publishes. It is 400 pages. It was written in 9 weeks. It is dedicated to a French statesman who excluded women from his recent report on public education. And the dedication is not a compliment. It is a challenge, a vindication of the rights of woman. Mary Wollstonecraft is 32 years old. She wrote in the introduction that she had written with a heat and urgency that did not always stop to smooth the surface of the argument. She was not apologizing. She was explaining. The argument had been building for years, collecting evidence from every household she had occupied and every woman she had known. and when it finally had the form and the occasion it needed, it came out at the pace of something long contained. The central argument is not complicated to state. Women are rational human beings. The weakness and irrationality that the world attributes to female nature is not natural. It is produced deliberately and systematically by an education designed to prevent women from developing their rational capacities. Change the education, she argued, and you change the woman. Give women the same quality of education that develops reason and character in men, applied with the same seriousness and the same expectations, and you produce a different kind of person entirely. This sounds, stated plainly, like a moderate position. In January of 1792, it was not moderate. In the context of a world where Rousseau's argument that women should be educated to please men was considered progressive, where the legal structure made married women legally invisible, where the social structure organized women's lives around the production of domestic comfort rather than the development of individual capability. The argument that women deserved education that developed their reason rather than suppressed it was not a moderate claim. It was incendiary. She knew this. She did not try to make it less so. She dedicated the book to Talleyrand, the French statesman and former bishop who had recently presented to the National Assembly a report on public education that excluded women from its scope. The dedication was a challenge. She was telling the men who were redesigning French society on the basis of Enlightenment principles that those principles, if they were real, could not stop at the edge of gender. The logic that justified the rights of men justified the rights of women. You could not claim one while denying the other without revealing that you were not applying a principle but protecting a privilege. The argument against Rousseau was the most philosophically substantial section of the book. Rousseau had built his entire philosophical project around the idea that civilization had corrupted natural human goodness, that the recovery of that goodness required a reformed relationship with education and nature. He was one of the founders of the argument that human beings were naturally good and that the corruptions of civilization had deformed them. And yet his prescription for women was to educate them into exactly the kind of artificial, performed, dependent creature that his critique of civilization was supposed to be arguing against. The contradiction was not subtle. Mary named it directly and did not soften it. The conduct books received equally careful attention. Fordyce and Gregory and their equivalents were not minor targets. They were among the most widely read books in English households, shaping the formation of actual women in ways that were concrete and daily. She went through their arguments with the precision of someone who has been living with the consequences of the philosophy they embodied. Advising women to affect ignorance in order to make men comfortable was not guidance toward happiness. It was guidance toward the systematic self-destruction of human potential. She said this in language that left nothing unclear. The book also argued for women's economic independence in terms that were, for 1792, remarkably concrete. Women needed access to education that would allow them to support themselves. They needed access to the professions. They needed the legal standing to manage their own affairs. These were not sentimental aspirations. They were the practical conditions without which the more philosophical arguments about reason and dignity meant nothing at all. The argument extended to marriage. The legal structure that made women invisible upon marriage, that transferred their property and their legal identity to their husbands, produced predictable and specific results. A woman who was legally and economically dependent on her husband had powerful incentives to prioritize his satisfaction over her own development. She became what the system needed her to be, a dependent, because the alternative, genuine independence, had been made legally and economically impossible. The most discussed section of the book was the one where Mary argued that the limitations visible in women of her era were not evidence of natural female incapacity. They were evidence of what the system had produced. Women educated to be ornamental and dependent had been shaped into persons who were vain, who were manipulative in the domestic sphere, because it was the only sphere where they had power, who were incapable of genuine friendship because they had been trained to see other women as competitors. These were the predictable results of a particular educational philosophy applied to human beings across generations. This part made some readers uncomfortable because it seemed to be criticizing women rather than defending them. Mary had a direct answer. She was criticizing the system. The women were the evidence of what the system cost. Their limitations were the proof of the argument, not the argument against it. The reception was immediate and wide. Across England, the radical press recognized what she had done. In America, where the question of women's rights had been raised by figures including Abigail Adams during the years of the Revolution without receiving the serious philosophical treatment it deserved. The book arrived into a conversation that had been waiting for this specific argument. The book was also read in France by those with English, and it circulated in the same intellectual circles where the future of the Republic was being debated. Though the full extent of this circulation is difficult to document precisely, the hostile reception was equally instructive about what the argument had hit. Horace Walpole, in a private letter that was widely repeated, called her a hyena in petticoats. This was the most quotable version of a wider pattern. The argument was not engaged on its own terms. The argument was described as indecent, as masculine, as the product of a woman who had stepped outside the boundaries of appropriate female behaviour in the very act of making it. Mary had addressed this move directly. Inside the book itself, the accusation of being unfeminine for arguing against the arrangement was precisely the move that the arrangement made against anyone who challenged it. Femininity, as defined by the conduct books and the social expectations of the period, was another word for compliance. To call her unfeminine was to use the definition produced by the system as a weapon against the person criticizing the system. She was right. Being right did not make the hostility less real. The book also created a specific vulnerability she had anticipated. The people who disagreed with her were now paying close attention to her life, looking for the evidence that would allow them to say that the argument could be dismissed because the person who made it was morally disqualified. She knew this weapon existed. She would not discover how it would be used until several years later. For now, she was 32 years old, famous in a way she had not been before, and making plans to travel to Paris. Paris, in late 1792, was a city where a king was about to be put on trial for his life. The revolution that had seemed, from London, like the vindication of everything Price had been arguing for, was beginning to show. Up close, the specific ways in which genuine principles can be captured by people who use them as justification for things the principles were never designed to justify. She was going to see it directly. That was how she had always operated. She was also, though she did not know this yet, about to meet the man whose treatment of her would be used against everything she had built. For a century after her death, His name was Gilbert Imlay, and that story belongs to the next chapter. Chapter 7. Paris in Revolution, Love. D'Angers and Gilbert Imlay. Paris. December 1792. The city arrives through the window of a hired carriage as something that the pamphlets and the political correspondence reaching London for 3 years had not fully conveyed. Not the ideas, the physical texture of it, the smell of a city that has been running a revolution for 3 years and is now, in this December, running something darker and more urgent alongside it. The streets near Mary's lodgings on the Rue Mesley are quieter than she expected. The quiet is not the quiet of peace. It is the quality of quiet that a city produces when it is holding its breath between one thing and the next. When the people moving through the streets are doing so with a specific awareness of what the wrong word in the wrong place might cost. She has come to see the revolution directly. This was entirely characteristic of her. She did not trust second-hand accounts when the primary source was accessible. The principles she had been defending in London, the arguments about natural rights and rational government that animated both the rights of men and the rights of woman, were being tested in real time in these streets. She needed to see what the testing looked like from inside the thing being tested. What she found was the revolution and also something alongside it that the principles had not predicted. King Louis XVI was tried in December of 1792 and executed in January of 1793. In a letter to Johnson written in those weeks, Mary described seeing the king's carriage moving through the streets near her lodgings on its way to the execution. She wrote that she had wept, and that the weeping surprised her. The recognition that what was happening was both the logical consequence of a principle she believed in and something that did not feel clean when you were close enough to see the specific person it was happening to. She kept watching. She kept writing. She was also in the social world of English and American expatriates gathering in Paris, beginning to meet people who would change the direction of her life. The English and American community in Paris in early 1793 was a specific kind of gathering, political believers and commercial adventurers, and the two categories were not always distinguishable from the outside. Sometimes they were not distinguishable from the inside either, because the same person could hold genuine political convictions and be alert to commercial possibility without experiencing any contradiction between them. Gilbert Imlay was, by the evidence of what followed, both things at once. He was American, from New Jersey. Somewhere in his middle 30s, when Mary met him in the spring of 1793, he had served in some capacity in the American Revolutionary War. He had spent time on the American frontier, in Kentucky, and had written a book about it, a topographical description of the Western Territory of North America, which Mary had read before meeting him. He was physically confident and easy in his manner, interested in politics and literature, and willing to engage with Mary's ideas as though they were worth engaging with. She fell in love with him. This biographical fact has been used for 2 centuries to argue that the woman who wrote The Rights of Woman was a hypocrite, or self-deluded, or incapable of living by her own principles. The argument goes, she argued for rational independence, and then became undone by a man who was not worth it. Therefore, the argument was wrong. Or she was wrong. Or both. This is not a serious argument. It is a standard that is never applied to male philosophers with complicated romantic lives, which means it is never applied to male philosophers at all. The romantic lives of male thinkers are considered context. The romantic lives of female thinkers are considered verdict. The direct response is this. Mary Wollstonecraft argued for women's rational independence and then experienced what human beings experience when they fall in love, which is a partial suspension of the rational faculty in the presence of the emotional one. This is not a refutation of the argument for independence. It is a demonstration of exactly why the structural conditions she argued for, legal standing, economic self-sufficiency, education, were necessary. The vulnerability that love produces is not a character failing that self-awareness can reason away. It is a feature of human experience, and the question is not whether it happens, but what resources a person has available when it does. In the world, Mary had argued for a woman who loved someone who turned out to be unreliable would have had legal and economic resources allowing her to recover. In the world that actually existed in 1793, she did not. Her vulnerability with Imlay was not the proof that her argument was wrong. It was a demonstration of exactly why her argument was necessary. She loved him in the spring of 1793, in a Paris where the revolution was accelerating toward the terror, and the city was becoming dangerous for foreigners in ways that were daily and immediate. The Committee of Public Safety was consolidating power. The English and American community was shrinking as people calculated what the coming months might produce. Imlay registered Mary with the American Embassy as his wife, which gave her the protection of American citizenship in a city where being English was becoming a liability. They were not married. The registration was a practical arrangement. It was also the first of several moments in the relationship where the line between genuine commitment and convenient arrangement was not entirely clear, at least not to Mary. She believed in him. This is the central fact of what followed. She was not naive in the ordinary sense. She was one of the most intellectually rigorous people of her generation. But she had, underneath the rigour, the specific vulnerability of a person who had not been unconditionally loved in childhood and who responded to what felt like genuine love with a completeness that left little in reserve. Her father had been unreliable. Her mother had been present, but not fully present. Fanny Blood had been the one person who had received her fully, and Fanny had died. Imlay arrived with warmth and attention and the specific comfort of making her feel, in a city becoming more dangerous by the week, that she was not alone. She gave him everything she had. The letters she wrote to him over the following 2 years are among the most direct documents of interior life from the period, honest about her own emotional states, with the same unflinching accuracy she brought to her political arguments. They are also, as the relationship progressed, increasingly painful to read, not because they are melodramatic, but because they are not. She was watching something happen that she did not want to be happening, and she was describing it with her characteristic precision. She became pregnant in late 1793. By early 1794, the terror was at its height, and Paris was genuinely dangerous. Imlay arranged for Mary to move to the town of Le Havre on the Normandy coast, where he had commercial interests in shipping. She went because Le Havre was safer, because she was pregnant, and because Imlay asked her to. She spent the spring and summer of 1794 in Le Havre, waiting for Imlay to arrive and writing. She was working on what would become an historical and moral view of the origin and progress of the French Revolution. Her attempt to understand what she had been watching since December of 1792. The revolution had not been, what the principal had promised. The terror was not the logical consequence of Enlightenment reason. It was something else. The way genuine ideas get captured by people who use them to justify what the ideas were never designed to justify. She was trying to understand this without abandoning the principles themselves, which she still believed in, while not pretending that what was happening in France was other than what it was. It was hard and serious intellectual work. She was doing it while pregnant, and while the letters from Imlay were arriving less frequently and with a quality she was beginning to read too clearly. Her daughter Fanny, named for Fanny Blood, was born in Le Havre in May of 1794. Mary described the birth in letters to Imlay with her characteristic directness, including her surprise at the intensity of the feeling the child produced in her. She had written about motherhood as an institution. The actual experience was different from the thinking about it, as actual experience generally is. Imlay was not there for the birth. He was in London on business. They returned to London in the spring of 1795, and in the weeks that followed, the pattern that had been visible in the letters became impossible to ignore. The historical record suggests Imlay had been conducting another relationship during his periods in London, managing two separate arrangements in the way that the period allowed men to manage such things without formal accountability. Mary received this information in stages, the way painful information arrives, first as a suspicion, then as something more substantial, then as a confirmation that reordered everything she had been looking at. She tried to end the relationship. She tried to rebuild it. She wrote letters that moved between clarity and desperation, in the way that letters written in the middle of grief move between those poles. Imlay, in the way of a man who felt guilty and wanted the guilt managed rather than examined, proposed a solution. He needed someone to travel to Scandinavia on his behalf, to investigate some missing cargo, a business matter of financial significance. She would be doing something useful while he managed things in London. She went. She took 14-month-old Fanny with her. She travelled through Sweden and Norway and Denmark in the summer of 1795 with her infant daughter and a nursemaid, investigating Imlay's commercial concerns, writing him letters that were simultaneously business reports, observations on the Scandinavian landscape and society, and an ongoing attempt to understand, through the quality of her engagement, whether there was anything left between them to repair. The letters from Scandinavia are among the best writing she ever produced. They would be published the following year as letters written during a short residence in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, and they are the work of a writer at the full height of her powers. She brings the same quality of close observation and honest analysis she had always brought to political questions to bear on the landscape and the people and the texture of life in a place far from everything she had known. She writes about the Norwegian fjords in summer light. She writes about the small fishing towns and the particular quality of the northern silence. She writes about what solitude does to a person's sense of their own existence when everything familiar has been removed. They are also, underneath the travel writing, the record of someone doing the emotional labour of a relationship that has already ended while refusing to acknowledge that it has ended. She returned to London in October of 1795. Imlay told her it was over. She had known it was over. She had known it for months. Knowing a thing and arriving at the moment when it is stated plainly are different experiences. And the plainness of the ending, after months of ambiguity, did something to her that the ambiguity had not quite managed. The next chapter belongs to what came next. It is told with the care and honesty it deserves. Chapter 8. 2 attempts. 1 river. And a reason to continue. A note before this chapter begins. What follows includes a discussion of serious emotional crisis, and 2 instances in which Mary attempted to end her own life. This account does not describe methods in detail. It focuses on context, the experience of the period, and what came after. If you or someone you know is struggling, crisis support is available. Resources are listed in the description of this video. London, October 1795. The city, outside the window, is going about its ordinary business. The street sounds that Mary has been hearing since she was born in a weaving district of this city are present and continuous, and entirely indifferent to what is happening in the room she is sitting in. She is 36 years old. She has a 14-month-old daughter. She has no reliable income. The relationship with Imlay has just ended with a plainness that removed the last of the ambiguity she had been navigating for months. She is a woman whose most famous book argued for the rational independence of women, sitting in a room in a city that has provided her with none of the structural conditions that rational independence requires. Mary Wollstonecraft attempted to end her own life twice, in the autumn and winter of 1795. These facts are documented in her own letters and in the account William Godwin later published, drawing on what Mary herself told him and on the correspondence that survived. They belong in this story not as scandal and not as evidence of weakness, but as events in the life of a specific human being under specific pressures, events that deserve to be understood in their full context rather than either hidden or used as evidence against her. The first attempt came in October. In the days following Imlay's final confirmation that the relationship was over, she survived. She wrote to Imlay afterward. The letter exists. It is not a letter of gratitude for survival. It is a letter of someone trying to explain, with her characteristic directness, what had brought her to that point and what she expected from him in its aftermath. His response was the response of a man who felt guilty and wanted the guilt managed. He arranged lodgings. He was, as he had been throughout their relationship, capable of warmth when warmth was convenient. The second attempt came a month later. In November, she went to Putney Bridge on a rainy evening. According to Godwin's account in the memoirs, written from what she later told him, she went into the river. She was pulled from the water by boatmen who reached her in time. She was brought to a nearby house. She recovered, over the following days, from the physical consequences. Before going further, it is worth placing what happened to Mary in a framework that the 18th century did not have and that we do. What she was experiencing in the autumn of 1795 would now be recognized as a severe depressive episode, very likely compounded by the biological aftermath of childbirth operating alongside the emotional devastation of the relationship's end and the practical precarity of her situation. She had no access to this framework. The language available to her for understanding what she was experiencing was the language of moral weakness, of sensibility without discipline, of the kind of emotional excess that was considered. In women of her era, both attractive in small doses and dangerous in large ones, she could not name what was happening to her accurately. She had only her considerable intelligence, her habit of honest self-examination, and the writing that had always been her primary means of processing the world. She used all three. The letters from this period are not melodramatic. They are precise. She writes about what she was experiencing with the accuracy of someone who has committed to not lying about her own interior states. Even when those states are ones the world would prefer, she managed more quietly. She writes about the specific quality of the exhaustion that followed, the particular strangeness of continuing to exist when the decision to stop had felt so complete. She also, because she was Mary Wollstonecraft, began turning the experience into something that could be used. The letters she had written to Imlay during the Scandinavian journey of the previous summer were in her possession. She revised them for publication with the care of a writer who understands that the best work she has done is being prepared for its proper audience. The book was published in January of 1796 as letters written during a short residence in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. It is, by the assessment of scholars, including her biographer Janet Todd, the finest writing she produced. This is not a coincidence. It is a demonstration of something that writers sometimes discover in their hardest periods, the faculties of observation and expression. When turned on experience that has been lived at full intensity, produce work with a depth and particularity that the more comfortable periods do not always generate. The Scandinavian letters describe the landscape and the people and the texture of life in Sweden and Norway and Denmark, with the close attention that was always her mode. The fjords, the small towns, the quality of the northern summer light, and what it does to a mind that is watching it while carrying a specific weight of loss. She writes about solitude and its relationship to selfhood, about the difference between chosen solitude and solitude that has been imposed by circumstances, about grief, not abstractly, but with the concrete specificity of someone who is inside it, and who has decided that the honest description of being inside it is more useful than the performance of having moved past it. These are not the letters of a woman who has been broken by what she has been through. They are the letters of a woman who is thinking, carefully and honestly. In the middle of it, William Godwin read the book when it was published. He had known Mary slightly through Johnson's circle for several years. They had met once before. At a dinner that had not gone particularly well, Godwin had wanted to hear Thomas Paine, and found Mary's tendency to lead the conversation irritating. Mary had found Godwin stiff and insufficiently flexible in his opinions. They had parted without particular regard for each other. But Godwin read the letters from Sweden and was affected by it in a way he later described with his characteristic honesty. He said that, if there had ever been a book calculated to make a man fall in love with its author, it was that one. He was not wrong about the book. He would prove not wrong about the rest of it either. The months between the second attempt and the renewed acquaintance with Godwin in the spring of 1796 were the months of rebuilding. Not dramatic months, not simple ones. She was 36 years old. She had a daughter approaching 2 years old, who was healthy and demanding and genuinely present in the way that small children are present. Little Fanny was, among other things, an anchor to the present moment at a time when the present moment needed anchoring. Mary was reviewing for Johnson. She was beginning to draft the novel that would become Maria, the fictional version of everything she had not been able to say in the political writing, the interior experience of women trapped by the legal structures she had argued against in the rights of woman. She was, slowly and with the specific caution of someone who understands what incaution costs, re-engaging with the world. In the spring of 1796, at one of Johnson's gatherings, she met William Godwin again. They were both different people than they had been at Johnson's table years before. and this time they recognized each other. Chapter 9. William Godwin and the Last Love. There is a detail about the relationship between Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin that most accounts mention briefly and then move past. They lived 300 yards apart and wrote each other letters almost every day. Not because they could not visit. They visited regularly, often, but they were both writers. Both people for whom language was the primary instrument of engagement with experience, and so the relationship existed simultaneously, in person and on paper. The paper record has survived, and it is, for anyone who wants to understand what they actually were to each other, the fullest account available. The letters are not love letters in the conventional sense of that phrase. They are the correspondence of two intellectually serious people who are also, increasingly, in love. And the two things are not separated from each other. They argue in these letters. They disagree about philosophy and politics and literature and the practical arrangements of their days. They are tender in ways that neither of them had been publicly tender before. They are honest in ways that most intimate correspondence of the period was not, because both of them had committed, as a philosophical principle held before the relationship began, to honesty as the foundation of genuine connection. They had found, in each other, someone who could sustain that commitment over time. This was not a small thing for either of them. Godwin was 40 years old. He had published Political Justice in 1793, one of the most discussed radical philosophical texts of the decade. He was a man of considerable intellectual reputation and genuine personal awkwardness, someone who had organized his life around ideas and had not previously found a person with whom the intellectual and the personal could coexist without one displacing the other. He had written, in Political Justice, that individual attachments could narrow a person's moral vision, that the particular loyalties of love and friendship might compete with the broader obligations of rational benevolence. He revised this view in light of what he experienced with Mary. This is one of the most honest things about him. He had written something he believed. He then experienced something that showed him the limitation of what he had written. He acknowledged the revision publicly. In the memoir, he later wrote about Mary, saying that loving her had taught him something about the value of particular attachment that his previous philosophy had not adequately grasped. He changed his mind, and he said so. Mary had arrived at this relationship with the full weight of what she had been through. She was 36 years old, and she had been through Imlay and the 2 attempts and the Scandinavian letters and the months of rebuilding. She was choosing, with full knowledge of what it costs to love someone and be wrong about them, to love again. The anxiety is in the letters. There are moments when the old fear surfaces, the recognition that she has given herself completely before, and that the completeness of the giving was not protection. She acknowledges this to Godwin directly. Without managing how the acknowledgement lands, he responds with a steadiness she had not previously encountered in a man she was in love with. She is funny in the Godwin letters in ways she is not funny anywhere else in the surviving record. She teases him about his philosophical rigidity. She disagrees with his literary assessments with a confidence that does not require justification. There is a lightness in these letters that is not present anywhere else in her correspondence. The specific lightness of someone who is being seen accurately by the person she is with, and who is allowing herself to be seen without managing how the seeing lands. Here is something that rarely appears in popular accounts of their relationship. Godwin kept a diary of his social and intellectual life that recorded, with the brevity of a man who treated the diary as a record rather than a narrative, the dates and locations of his meetings with Mary. Scholars who have studied these entries have noted what the diary's spare notations nevertheless communicate. The frequency of meetings increased steadily over the months following their renewed acquaintance in the spring of 1796, from occasional to regular to daily, with the specific trajectory of two people who are discovering, incrementally and then all at once, that they cannot do without each other. They decided not to live together. This was a considered decision, not a practical compromise. Both of them had written about the ways conventional domestic arrangements could damage the independence and intellectual vitality of the people within them, particularly women. They maintained their separate houses 300 yards apart, visited regularly, and wrote letters on the days when their work kept them apart. The arrangement was, by the standards of 1796 London, genuinely unusual. It required both of them to think carefully about what they wanted from the relationship and what they needed to maintain independently of it. The letters are the record of two people doing this thinking together, which meant doing it honestly and sometimes getting it wrong and then correcting it. The philosophical disagreement between them that came up most regularly concerned the mechanisms of political change. Godwin believed in gradualism, the slow transformation of society through the rational persuasion of individuals, one mind at a time. Mary's experience of the French Revolution had given her a more complicated view. She had seen what happened when ideas were captured by people who used them as justification for terror. She had also seen, in the Scandinavian journey, the specific conditions on the ground that were not amenable to the pace of rational persuasion alone. They argued about this in person and in letters. Neither fully converted the other. Both were modified by the exchange. This is what intellectual partnership looks like when it is working. The pregnancy arrived in late 1796. Mary was 37 years old. It was not planned. It was also not, in the context of two people conducting an intimate relationship with genuine intention of permanence, entirely surprising. The practical question the pregnancy raised was their public position. Mary had a daughter, Fanny, born outside of marriage. A second child, in the same circumstances, would create legal complications for the child's standing, and both Mary and Godwin were on the public record as opponents of the institution of marriage. Godwin had written in Political Justice that marriage was the worst of monopolies. Mary had argued, in The Rights of Woman, that the legal subordination of women within marriage was incompatible with the rational equality she was advocating. They got married on March 29th, 1797, at St. Pancras Church. The decision was not a philosophical capitulation. It was a practical accommodation to the legal realities of a world that had not yet caught up with their arguments. The marriage would protect the child's standing. It would provide Mary with legal protections that the world she actually lived in offered only within the institution she had criticized. They were not abandoning the principle. They were acknowledging the distance between the principle and the world that existed. Mary had been navigating that distance her entire adult life. The public response to the marriage was immediate and revealing. By marrying Godwin, Mary confirmed publicly that she had not, in fact, been married to Imlay, which meant Fanny was legally illegitimate. This had been known to some people already, but had not been confirmed. The same circles that had admired the rights of woman now had the specific information they had been looking for. The weapon had been loaded. It would be fired 4 months later, by Godwin himself, in an act of love whose consequences he had not fully calculated. But that is the next chapter. For now, they were married, and the Polygon House became a gathering point for the intellectual life of London in these months. She was working on Maria, the unfinished novel. She was 37 years old, and she had survived everything she had survived, and she had arrived, at last, at something that resembled the life she had always been arguing was possible. On August 30th, 1797, the labour began. Chapter 10. The Death that Defined the Myth. The labour was long and difficult. The infant was delivered successfully in the small hours of August 31st. She was healthy. She was named Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, and she arrived in the world in the house on the Polygon in Somers Town, attended by a man midwife named Thomas Poignand, who had been called when the delivery proved complicated. The complication was with the placenta, which did not deliver cleanly. Poignand made multiple attempts to address this with the methods that the medicine of 1797 had available. It was the standard intervention of the period. It was also, though no one in that room could have known this, the introduction of the infection that would kill her. The germ theory of disease did not exist in 1797. No one present understood that the instruments used in the delivery were carrying the bacteria that would produce the fever beginning 2 days after the birth. Puerperal fever, childbed fever, was among the most common causes of death for women of childbearing age in this period. It moved from fever to systemic infection with a speed that the medicine of 1797 had almost nothing adequate to answer. Godwin was in the house. He had been given no reason, in the first hours after the birth, to believe anything was wrong beyond the ordinary difficulty of a complicated delivery. Mary was exhausted. The infant was healthy. Everything seemed, in those first hours, to be resolving in the normal way. By the second day the fever had started. Godwin recorded its progress in his diary with the precision of a man who has decided that accuracy is the only form of control available to him. He recorded the times when she was able to speak and what she said. He recorded the visits of the physicians and what they tried. He recorded the hours when she seemed better and the hours when she seemed worse. He was not writing for publication at this point. He was writing because writing was the only thing he could do that felt like doing something. The physicians came, several of them, called in consultation over 11 days, each representing the best that London medicine in 1797 could offer. Various treatments were administered. The fever continued. There were days when she seemed to improve. Godwin recorded these with a care that suggests he was not allowing himself to believe in them too fully. He had been watching carefully enough by the 4th and 5th days to understand that the underlying direction of the illness was not toward recovery. Mary was conscious through much of the first week, in the intermittent way that a high fever permits consciousness. She spoke to Godwin. She asked about the baby. She spoke to the friends who came to sit with her. She was, in the periods when the fever allowed it, fully herself, which is to say, she was direct and sometimes dry and sometimes tender, and entirely without the performance of appropriate dying behaviour that the conventions of the period would have suggested. Godwin recorded that she said, at one point, that she had not known it was possible to feel what she felt for another person. She was speaking about him. He wrote it down. She asked him to take care of Fanny, little Fanny, almost 3 years old, who was Imlay's daughter and who had no father present to claim her. Godwin said he would. He kept that promise for the rest of his life, raising Fanny as his own daughter. The friends came and went. Johnson came. Everyone who came recorded something of what they witnessed. The small particular observations that people make when they understand they are in the presence of something ending that they will need to carry. By the 8th day, the improvement had not come. By the 9th day, the physicians were speaking in terms that no longer suggested recovery as a realistic outcome. By the 10th day, Mary was less often conscious, and the consciousness that came and went was thinner. The specific quality of a mind losing its purchase on the world it has inhabited. On September 10th, 1797, at 20 minutes to 8 in the evening, she died. She had been moved to a sick room better suited for the physician's attendance during the 11 days of her illness. Godwin was beside her. He wrote the time in his diary. He also recorded the specific quality of the moment, that the transition from the shallow, difficult breathing that had been the primary evidence of her continued presence to the absence of that breathing was not dramatic. She was 38 years old. He closed the diary. He did not write in it again for several days. The infant Mary was 10 days old and healthy. Little Fanny, nearly 3, was told that her mother was gone. Godwin recorded that she asked for her mother, and that answering this question was among the hardest things he had done in those days. Mary was buried on the 15th of September in the churchyard of St. Pancras, the church where she and Godwin had married 6 months earlier. Godwin did not attend the burial. His private grief and his capacity for managing it publicly had reached different limits. He stayed at the house. He sat among her books and her papers and the unfinished manuscript of Maria and the infant who had her mother's name. He began to write. What he wrote was Memoirs of the Author of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, published in January of 1798, 4 months after her death. He wrote it because he believed, with the absolute conviction of a man who had committed his intellectual life to honesty, that she deserved to be known as she actually was, rather than as a more convenient version of herself. He told everything: the 2 attempts, the relationship with Imlay and little Fanny, the earlier complicated attachment to Fuseli, the pregnancy before the marriage. He told it with love and with the philosophical courage of someone who has decided that truth is more valuable than comfort. He was right about what she deserved. He was catastrophically wrong about what the world was ready to do with the truth he was offering. The response to the memoirs was not engagement with the life he had described. It was the transformation of everything he had revealed into evidence against her. The conversion of her actual life into the proof that her argument had been wrong all along. Here was the woman who had argued for women's rational independence. And here was her life. The argument went, look at what happens when a woman rejects the proper order of things. The illegitimate child, the man who abandoned her, the 2 crises, the pregnancy before the marriage. It was not a refutation of the rights of woman. It was the oldest move available against any argument made by a person whose personal life can be found wanting. The substitution of biography for argument, the attempt to discredit the idea by discrediting the person who had it. It worked. Not immediately and not completely, but for a very long time. Chapter 11. Godwin's Mistake and a Century of Burial. London, 1801. 4 years after her death. Mary Wollstonecraft's name is already doing something specific in the conversations of people who discuss women's education and women's rights. It is closing conversations rather than opening them. It is being used as a warning rather than an argument. It is the name invoked not to engage with a position, but to suggest that the person holding it might end up the same way. This is what Godwin's honesty had produced. He had loved her genuinely and deeply. He had believed she deserved to be known fully. He had told the truth about her with care and with philosophical conviction, and the world had taken the truth he offered and used it as a weapon against everything she had spent her life building. The pattern of the hostile reception was consistent and revealing. The reviews of the memoirs were not simply critical of Godwin's judgment in publishing, they were contemptuous of Mary. And the contempt was directed not at the quality of her thinking, but at the life he had described. The two crises were offered as proof that sensibility without discipline was dangerous. The relationship with Imlay and little Fanny were offered as proof that the rejection of conventional morality led to misery. The life Godwin had described with genuine love was being read as the evidence the critics had been waiting for. None of this was a counter-argument to the rights of woman. It was the move that the book had predicted and named. The use of a woman's personal life as the instrument of her intellectual dismissal. It worked in the specific environment of the early 19th century because the political and cultural atmosphere was shifting. The French Revolution had not produced the rational republic that its principles had promised. It had produced the Terror and then Napoleon. The reaction against revolutionary ideals in England was substantial, and the reaction against the women who had argued for rights in the language of those ideals was part of it. The women who were beginning to organize and argue for change in the early decades of the 19th century understood this practically. They were working in an environment already primed to find any excuse to dismiss their arguments and discredit their persons. They could not afford, in this environment, to be associated with the woman whose life had been so comprehensively used as evidence against the argument they were trying to make. They did not disavow her exactly. They simply did not invoke her. Her name was allowed to quietly disappear from the conversation. The Rights of Woman went out of print. New generations of women who were educated enough to have encountered it did not encounter it, because the channels of female intellectual life had stopped carrying it. Hannah More occupied the space. More was also writing about women's education in the early 19th century, and her argument was the inverse of Mary's. Women should be educated to be better wives and mothers, more genuinely virtuous within their proper sphere rather than extended beyond it. More's argument was comfortable. It reinforced existing arrangements. It was publishable and respectable and widely read, and it occupied the space in the conversation that Mary had vacated. The contrast was made explicit by people who wanted to make it explicit. This is what writing about women's education looks like when it is done properly. Not the dangerous radicalism of the woman who ended up in the Thames, Mary Shelley. The daughter lived with the weight of this in ways that were specific and personal. She was 10 days old when her mother died. She grew up in Godwin's house, surrounded by her mother's books and her mother's papers and her mother's reputation, which was the reputation the memoirs had produced. She knew who her mother had been, and what her mother had written, and what the world had made of both. Here is something worth knowing about Mary Shelley that most accounts pass over lightly. She began writing Frankenstein in the summer of 1816, when she was 18 years old. On a stormy night at a villa on Lake Geneva, when a group of writers challenged each other to produce a ghost story. she published it 2 years later. It is the story of a creature brought into existence by someone who did not fully understand the consequences of creation, who was abandoned by his creator before he could be prepared for the world, who spent his existence searching for the connection that would make it bearable, and who was judged everywhere he went, not by what he was capable of, but by what he looked like to people who were afraid of him. Whether Frankenstein is about Mary Shelley's mother is a question literary scholars have debated for 2 centuries. What is not in question is that Mary Shelley grew up understanding, from the inside, the specific shape of what it meant to be the child of Mary Wollstonecraft in the world the memoirs had produced. She wrote about her mother in later life with great care and genuine affection, describing her as one of those rare people who appear in a generation and leave behind them a track of light. The track of light had been dimmed, for most of the 19th century, to something close to invisible. The suffrage movement that emerged in the middle decades of the 19th century drew on many intellectual sources. The Declaration of Sentiments produced at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, the foundational document of American feminist politics, drew on the language of the Declaration of Independence, arguing for the rights of women in the terms that the American tradition made available. It made the argument that the rights of woman had made in the same terms. 56 years earlier, the argument was present. The name was not, the burial was not total. John Stuart Mill, whose The Subjection of Women, published in 1869, is one of the foundational texts of liberal feminist thought, was working in a tradition the rights of woman had helped establish. William Thompson cited her explicitly in his appeal of One Half the Human Race in 1825, one of the most rigorous early 19th century arguments for women's political rights. But these were the exceptions. The mainstream had moved on without her, and so she lay in the churchyard of St. Pancras, and the book that had changed the terms of a conversation lay out of print, and the argument she had made with everything she had was being made by other people who did not always know where it had come from. That is, the specific cruelty of the burial, not that the argument died. The argument did not die. It continued in the logic of every demand made by every woman who followed her. But the name attached to the argument, the person who had assembled it and paid for it, that was what was lost. The consequence without the cause. The fruit without the root. Then, in 1929, Virginia Woolf named the root. In a room of one's own, Woolf wrote about the specific conditions women writers had historically required and been denied. The money and the space and the uninterrupted time that were the material prerequisites for sustained intellectual work. She was making an argument with deep roots in what Mary had argued in 1792, and she knew it, and she said so clearly. She called Mary Wollstonecraft a founder, not a historical figure to be admired from a respectful distance, someone whose work was the origin point of something still ongoing, whose questions were still the questions that needed answering, whose argument was still being made because the conditions it was arguing against were still in place. The naming mattered, and somewhere in the churchyard of St. Pancras, under the trees that had grown tall in the century, and more since she was buried there, the root that had never stopped living began, at last, to be recognized again. Chapter 12. The Long Resurrection. There is a specific quality to ideas that are true. They do not stay buried. You can suppress them. You can allow the name of the person who first stated them clearly to disappear from the conversation. You can let the book go out of print and let the arguments be made by other people without attribution, and let the founding voice be forgotten by the very movement it founded. You can do all of this, and the ideas remain, encoded in the logic of every argument that descends from them, waiting for the moment when someone has enough clarity and enough courage to name the source. Virginia Woolf named the source in 1929. The full recovery took longer, and it took the form of a movement. The second wave feminist mobilization that emerged in the late 1960s and continued through the 1970s was a movement in urgent need of its intellectual history. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, published in 1963, had named the specific form that the subordination of women's intellectual and professional life was taking in mid-century America. The domestic ideal of the post-war period, the narrowing of women's lives into the management of households and the emotional needs of others. She was doing, for 1963, what Mary had done for 1792, naming the system, analysing the machinery, arguing that the limitation was not natural, the structural similarity was not accidental. The tradition ran from the rights of woman through the suffrage movement and the early 20th century feminist intellectuals to Friedan's generation, a tradition that had been underground for a century but had not been broken. The Rights of Woman was reprinted in new editions during the 1970s and began appearing in university curricula with increasing regularity. Students who had never heard her name encountered, in survey courses on political thought and introductory classes in feminist theory, a book written in 1792 that read, in its fundamental claims, as though it had been written for them. This was the quality that the century of burial had been designed to prevent from being recognized. The Rights of Woman was not a historical document in the sense of a text that tells you about the past. It was a living argument. Its claims about the relationship between education and the development of human rational capacity were still applicable. Its analysis of the ways that social expectations shape the persons formed within them was still accurate. Its demand for the material conditions of independence, education, legal standing, economic self-sufficiency, was still a demand for things that were still not fully in place. Reading it in a university classroom in 1975 was not an act of historical recovery. It was an act of recognition. The students recognized the argument because they were living inside the conditions it was arguing against, in modified but recognizable and continuous forms. The scholarly recovery deepened through the following decades. Janet Todd's biography, published in 2000, drew on the full range of available letters and documents to reconstruct the actual texture of the life, not the myth that had replaced it. Lyndall Gordon's Vindication, published several years later, brought a novelist's precision to the specific scenes and moments of a life that the documentary record made more accessible than most. The letters were there. The diary was there. The published work was there. The recovery could be done, and was done, with the care that the subject had earned and had been denied for 100 years. Here is something worth sitting with before this night is over. If Mary Wollstonecraft had been a man, what would the historical assessment look like? Not a rhetorical question. An honest one. A writer who published a foundational text of political philosophy at 32, who argued, with genuine intellectual rigour, that the limitations attributed to half the human population were not natural but produced by social conditions. and who provided the philosophical framework for understanding how those conditions operated and how they might be changed? Who produced, in the Scandinavian letters, travel writing of genuine literary distinction, who lived a life of considerable difficulty with a consistency of intellectual engagement that did not waver through poverty and loss and public hostility and private crisis? If a man had done all of this, the literature would be large, and the assessments would be, in the main, admiring. The literature on Mary Wollstonecraft is now large. The assessments have been, for most of the time since her death, organized primarily around her personal life and the implicit question of whether a woman of her choices and her appetites could be taken seriously as a thinker. The answer, which the evidence requires, is that she can be taken seriously as a thinker because she was one. And the question of whether her personal life is more disqualifying than the personal lives of the male thinkers she argued alongside is a question that answers itself once it is stated clearly. She was not wrong. She was buried. There is a difference. The recovery of Mary Wollstonecraft was not simply the recovery of a historical figure. It was the recovery of a way of looking at the world, a refusal to accept the official account of what is natural and what is possible, a commitment to examining the systems that produce the people within them rather than accepting those people as evidence of natural limits. She had learned this way of looking in a cold house in a weaving district of East London, sleeping outside her mother's door, watching the specific mechanics of how a woman could be diminished by the arrangement she lived within. She had developed it through the years of self-education, and the Price Circle, and the Newington Green School, and the Johnson Rooms, and Paris and the Imlay relationship, and the Scandinavian letters, and the months of rebuilding, and the house on the Polygon, where Godwin wrote down the time. She had brought it, fully formed and fully charged, to the 9 weeks in which she wrote the argument she had been building her entire life. The argument stands. Not because Mary Wollstonecraft was a saint, or a symbol, or a convenient founder for a cause that needed one. Because the argument was true when she made it in 1792, and it is still true, and the conditions it identified and argued against are still present in forms she would recognize, even if the specific vocabulary has changed. Tonight, somewhere in the world, a student is reading The Rights of Woman for the first time. In a library, or a dorm room, or at a kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside them, they are reading a book written 230 years ago by a woman who taught herself by firelight in a cold house in Spitalfields, and who spent her adult life insisting, against the full weight of the world's indifference, that the limitation was not natural. They are reading it and they are recognizing it. That is what true things do. They survive the burial. They come back. They find the reader who needs them. She did not finish everything she started. She did not live to see the legal changes her argument demanded, let alone the full realization of what she had argued was possible. She was 38 years old, and the manuscript of Maria was still on her desk, and the last page was not yet finished. But she left behind the argument, the girl who slept outside her mother's door, the woman who crossed the Bay of Biscay in November, whether because Fanny needed her, the writer who sat at her desk in the dark of the early morning before the household woke up and kept working because the alternative, which was silence, cost more than she was willing to pay. Her name was Mary Wollstonecraft. She wrote one of the earliest blueprints for modern women's rights in 1792. History punished her for it. For 100 years. Then she came back. Now, you know why. Sleep well,